5 foundational truths just because it's important. You're a Aspire person. We're going to learn all about this tonight. Can't wait. Bad news, pain and suffering is unavoidable, takes a toll, but the good news is that you can actually control trauma because it is there you go, an emotional response to pain and suffering. Pain can be repurposed as a gift. We've already kind of been talking about that, and trauma in your life has the potential to be the greatest source of growth. Now, for those of you that have been here from day one, do these 5 foundational truths hit different than the first time you saw them? And that's hopefully the goal. So here's what I want to do, return to this question. What would optimal growth look like, sound like, feel like for you and members of your family? You've already answered that question before, and this is sort of, when I said last week, like, how do we put it all together, right? This is where we have the end goal in mind. So equipped with adverse childhood experiences and their impact, knowing what post-traumatic growth looks like, knowing what each step of growth looks like, what's the end goal? All right, and there's 2 definitions that I like to work with specifically. First one is Dallas Willard, and it's so simple, a pervasive sense of well-being. To just, that's what we want after trauma, right? It's just go, it's fine, I'm okay. But I love these definitions. Borthwick and Ripper. It's this book right here. Ooh, this book. It's somewhere.
Right here, probably.
Yep, that one. That's right, I grabbed it to draw on. If you're a Christian and you're interested in this topic at all, I remember reading this book and going, oh, I guess I don't have to do my project anymore, because they basically wrote what I would have written a book about. But in this book, they say, and so they're writing from a Christian perspective, right? What's the end goal? It's circumstance transcending joy that flows from the conviction that God, and if you're not a Christian, that's fine, God, whoever God is to you, is doing something bigger than we understand, right? Or in other words, being content or grateful even when I know I am not always in control of my circumstances. If I can still have that contentment or that gratitude, even though I can't control it, that's the end goal, right? But then this is my favorite quote right here. The bottom line with hardship and suffering as it pertains to growth and transformation is that we have a choice. To borrow a simplistic phrase, suffering can make us bitter or better. And we want better. For sure. Right? And so I think it's important that we kind of come back to this question to say, the tool that I'm about to introduce to you, that's the whole point, is this pervasive sense of well-being is just getting better, not getting bitter. Even neutral's fine, but we just don't want to get bitter. We want to try and get to that positive. And so in this book, too, they have this brilliant imagery that I love. Do you want to be a thermometer? When you think about your pain and suffering and then the trauma that comes with it, right? You can't avoid pain and suffering, but when it comes to trauma, do you want to be a thermometer? Meaning, do you want to be the kind of person that observes and reports the temperature of the heat that you're experiencing or the toxic stress? We all know what that sounds like. Oh, it's so hot out here. Everything's so miserable. Do you just want to be the person that observes it and reports it, or do you want to be a thermostat? The type of person that determines the temperature in the face of heat and toxic stress, right? That's sort of the decision that we have, is do you want to be a thermometer or a thermostat? And what I would say, and that's the whole point of tonight, is why not both? Why not both? But I would say the order matters. The order matters. And so I have been waiting with bated breath to show you this video since the moment I met you.
There are only 2 kinds of people who do not experience painful emotions. The first kind are the psychopaths. The second kind are dead. There is a false understanding or expectation that a happy life means being happy all the time. No, learning to accept and even embrace painful emotions is an important part of a happy life, and the study of painful emotions is an important part of the field of happiness studies. My name is Tal Ben-Shahar. I'm a student and teacher in the field of happiness studies, and my most recent book is Happier No Matter What. There is a very important concept that was introduced by Nassim Taleb, and that is anti-fragility. Anti-fragility is essentially resilience 2.0. Resilience 1.0 is when we put pressure on a system. After the pressure is lifted, that system goes back to its original form. Anti-fragility takes this idea a step further. You put pressure on a system, it actually grows bigger, stronger. We see anti-fragile systems all around us and within us. For example, our muscular system. We go to the gym and we lift weights. We're putting pressure on our muscles. What happens as a result? We actually grow stronger. We're an anti-fragile system. On the psychological level, you know what that's called? PTG, post-traumatic growth. So where post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, is about breaking down, post-traumatic growth is about growing stronger. As a result of pressure, stress, it's anti-fragility. The role of the science of happiness is to teach us what conditions we can put in place to increase the likelihood of growing from hardship. Now, there is a paradox when it comes to pursuing happiness. On the one hand, we know that happiness is a good thing, whether in and of itself or as a means toward other ends. At the same time, we also know from research by Iris Moss and others that people who say to themselves, happiness is important for me, I want to pursue it, those individuals actually end up being less happy. In fact, they're more likely to experience depression. So the paradox is that on the one hand, happiness is clearly a good thing. On the other hand, valuing it as a good thing is problematic. So what do we do? The way to resolve this paradox is that we pursue happiness indirectly. Think about sunlight. So if I look at the sun directly, it's going to hurt my eyes. However, if I break down sunlight into its elements, into its constituents, I can look at the colors of the rainbow. So I'm indirectly looking at the sunlight, enjoying it, savoring it. In the same way, pursuing happiness directly can cause more harm than good, but breaking it down into its elements can lead us to enjoy the indirect pursuit of happiness and by extension, to raise our overall levels of happiness. What are the metaphorical colors of the rainbow when it comes to happiness? Here we have what I've come to call the SPIRE model, and it can trigger the anti-fragile system. SPIRE is an acronym that stands for spiritual, physical, intellectual, relational, and finally, emotional well-being. Spirituality is about finding a sense of meaning and purpose in life, at work and at home. If you wake up in the morning with a purpose, you're more likely to overcome barriers. When it comes to physical well-being, the most important idea to look at is stress, the silent killer. In the United States, more than half of the employees do not use up their vacation time. And even those that do, close to half are still tethered to their work. The problem is not the stress, it's the lack of recovery. With intellectual well-being, there's research showing that people who are curious, who ask questions, are not just happier, they also live longer. Another important element is not just asking questions, it's deeply engaging with material. It can be text, a work of art, even nature. Relational well-being is very important. The number one predictor of happiness is quality time we spend with people we care about and who care about us. And it turns out the number one condition that we can put in place to increase the likelihood of anti-fragility of growing through hardship is the quality of our relationships. Finally, emotional well-being. So embracing painful emotions is critical, but how do we then cultivate pleasurable ones? Specifically, the emotion of gratitude. Cicero talked about gratitude as the mother of all virtues. When we appreciate the good in our life, we have more of it. So happiness is much more than pleasure. Happiness is whole being. These 5 elements together create that sunlight, happiness. I don't think there is a point before which one is unhappy, after which one is happy. Rather, happiness resides on a continuum. It's a lifelong journey. And knowing that, we can have realistic rather than unrealistic expectations about what is possible. I do not think that things necessarily happen for the best. However, we can learn to make the best of things that happen.
Get smarter faster with videos from the world's biggest thinkers. To learn even more from the world's biggest thinkers, get Big Think Plus for your business.
So this wheel right here is, so just a editorialization as a pastor for what you just said, Christians need to feel joy all the time. One of the things that I love that Scripture has in it is the book, like I said, Ecclesiastes, but also laments. Because what this process is that you're about, and I'm going to go through each step, it's basically forming a lament. And a lament is not just complaining. A lament has basically 2 steps. Get it all out, and then let's deal with truth, right? But it's so important that it starts with emotional honesty, right? Anti-fragility, that ability to grow out of pressure, it happens when we let emotional honesty live in harmony with challenging truths, right? Thermometer, emotional honesty, thermostat. Let's change stuff, which is why you have what's in front of you. This is what I call the anti-fragility wheel. Much like the scales, it's something that I created, no joke. I think I told you the story last time, but I watched that video that you just watched. That's what created this. And then once my father-in-law said, actually, did I tell you that story last week? Yeah. I tend to start emotionally. That's when this whole thing came to be. And so I'm going to go through each step. And so what you have in front of you is a Christian faith-based version and then also a non-faith-based version. And again, the reason I keep making that distinction is because I don't know what any of your faith backgrounds are, but also B, I don't assume that the people that you might want to help after this class are going to be thinking the same as you spiritually. So do you even just have 2 options where maybe it removes some of the faith-based language, it'll help. With that said, I'm going to be operating out of the faith-based one. So the one that does not say God, higher power on the top, but you can look at both and kind of compare and contrast. And additionally, I'm going to be using 2 stories intermittently. We'll call her Sarah and we'll call her John, because I've taken about 40 people through this process or over, but Sarah and John have the 2 stories that stand out to me the most. And so I'll kind of use those as examples. Begin here. So, ACEs, I know how trauma affects me. Post-traumatic growth, I know what I'm aiming for. Scales of trauma, I think I know where I'm at. Now, how do I do the work? We begin here. What does that mean? Beginning or finding a beginning point. We consider all the available definitions of trauma, right? Biblical, but also the clinical, professional, and academic. I've given you probably 8 different definitions of trauma since we've been here. For me, I prefer to, because it's my degree and it's kind of what I'm hoping to contribute, is from a faith perspective, I think this should be the definition of trauma, the suffering effects that are felt and or caused by sin. All right? It's usually felt first and then it's caused. But this is my prioritized definition. But if you're trying to find a beginning point to grow out of, here are some questions. And these are all based out of either, the first 3 are based out of the clinical definition, and the last 2 are based out of some different literature. What was a moment that made you feel unsafe or unstable? Did a moment just come to mind? Where have you sensed impending catastrophe in your life? What's out of your control that threatens you? I'll leave these up for a second so people can write it down. What do you want that you don't have? We talked about this with the definition of suffering. What do you want that you don't have? Anxiety, depression, poor health. And what do you have that you don't, what do you want that you don't have? Or what do you have that you don't want? So the reverse of it. What's something that you're yearning for, longing for? Janine, your granddaughter, coming to Christ, something that you want, but it's not quite a reality, right? What part of your assumed world, remember how it's supposed to be, is being challenged or threatened? And then we chatted about this last week, but what suffering in your life has caused you to have blinders? And what I mean by that is we talked about what's the worst type of suffering. It's my suffering. I don't care about someone else's suffering when I'm suffering. So what has caused you to be so inconsiderate or careless about the suffering in other people's lives? That make sense? I'm going to start a follow-up list because Sue asked me to, and these are questions that I should probably include for follow-up. Am I good to move on? No. That's fine. Oh. So when you go ahead. So when you consider these questions, this is where for me, I think about, especially when I started doing my doctorate of ministry in trauma, people were like, really? And it's like, well, I don't know a single human that can't answer one of these questions. And if that's true, then everyone's traumatized to some degree or another. It doesn't mean that it's debilitating, but if you can answer one of those questions, then you can start, okay? Janine, I promise I'll get it to you if you don't have them. I promise you. So that first track, we start with emotional, we go around. You might see it on your paper. This is the reflection or fragile track. And what's important about this is you allow yourself to not care about the truth, to not care about honesty, to just say, or to not care about what is accurate. I need to get everything out. And so emotionally, so let's go to, I'll go to Sarah. Sarah and John simultaneously. For Sarah, her situation was her dad had just died. And did I tell you the story last week? Her dad had just died, and then her cousin basically said, I don't have time to talk. So that situation. And then John was a young man who I'd been walking with him for 10 years. He had gone away from the faith, came back, and then for 3 years, he was just like, this is my dream job at this place. I need this job. And 2 weeks after he finally took the plunge to say, I'm going to go into ministry full time, which I had been encouraging him since the day I met him, a week after, he finally got offered his dream job out of the blue. And so he was like, what is going on? Like, why would I be working so hard for 3 years, and when I finally give it up, it gets presented to me, right? And so those are the begin here moments. And so these are the questions we ask. I'm going to go through them each real quick from an emotional perspective. And I'll tell you sort of how I think through this. How did you feel initially? And what I'll typically do, you can do this as a caregiver or personally. Write down every single emotion that you can remember. If you're caregiving, point out where there might be conflicting emotions. It's okay if they're conflicting, you're just noticing it. But personally, I'll tell you, for both of them, it was like, just get it all out. How'd you feel? Well, I was pissed, okay? Angry, okay? Confused, sad, all these different emotions. And what's interesting is some of them start to conflict, and even just pointing that out to someone or even acknowledging it yourself. I'm scared and I'm happy, or I'm scared and I'm excited. How do those two things exist at the same time? So just complete emotional inventory of how you feel. Second, who did I tell? How did they respond? In both John and Sarah's case, what do you think their answer was to this question? You. It's usually where the problem starts, right? Because we talk about post-traumatic growth being able to build a narrative, to share it, and for it to be heard. sometimes this is where people don't even get going in terms of growing. It's who did you tell? And in the how did they respond, if they've told 20 people, I say, okay, pick the 3 people whose opinion that you value the most, you trust the most, and what did they say? How would you break it down into 1 to 2 sentences? And what I find is typically they all agree with each other. It's just advice. And so if you look at the non-Christian version, it's, the growth piece is what's advice that I've been given that I haven't taken. And so it's just being able for them to identify, here's what people who matter to me in my life have said. What questions did I wrestle with? It doesn't matter what the question was, but from an intellectual standpoint, right? For John, it was, why would God give me this opportunity as soon as I finally let it go? Like, is he just trying to mess with me? Is he just trying to dig at me, right? And for Sarah, it was, is she stupid? Like, does she not get it was my dad who died, not her? So what in the world is she even, right? It's what questions it does, and you don't need to answer them. It's just inventorying. Physical. We've talked so much about this. It's how did my body react? Could be weight loss, weight gain. It could be, physical injured sickness, your immune system's compromised, lack of sleep, right? What did I notice changed in me physically? I don't know if anyone ever asked that question after a traumatic event. Or, sorry, not anyone. I would say 95% of people don't even consider that, and they just think, oh, it's because I'm not exercising. And then the last question is, what does God have to say about this? I'll come back to that. And then we go to the growth and anti-fragile track. You'll see why in just a moment. Start with the same question, but we work our way the other way around. Right? And so at this point, we are actually prioritizing accuracy and truth over emotional honesty. When I get back to the moment of the turn, you'll understand why that's an important distinction. But this is where we want to say, now let's actually be right. Let's get this right so that we can move forward. How does my body need to express this? For my wife, when toxic stress overwhelms her, she needs isolation. Leave me alone. Let me go sit, let me go think. There is holes all over my garage that could be a museum of me needing to physically exert my frustration. Haven't hit anyone or harmed anyone. That's I was abused as a kid, so that's a line I won't cross. I got no problem harming my own property if I know I can fix it. And so if you go in my garage, you're like, oh, yep, that's where he got mad. That's where he got mad. I broke a garden hoe once. Trying to be responsible because I didn't want to hit a wall, so I hit a bag instead. The thing snapped in half, and it sobered me up in a second because I was like, oh, great. Now I got to go buy a new garden hoe and tell my wife what happened. But even in that, trust me, it's not, I'm not proud to share that example, but in expressing that, even in that moment, it shut me down because I realized the consequences of what I just did. Without harming someone. It's like, gosh dang it, I'm gonna spend $25. I have to explain this tantrum when everything's fine tomorrow and everything, it's, so how do I need to express it? Do I need to go for a run? Do I need isolation? What do I need to do? It's not on there for some reason, but why would a good God allow this? And I think, and in the non-Christian version, it's what is this trying to teach me, this pain and suffering, right? We wanna add value, we wanna add meaning to the pain and suffering. But why would a good God allow this? If you remember in the video, he said, it's not just the amount of questions, but it's the depth. This is a good intellectual question, right? Because you're questioning the very goodness of the person that you're calling good from the get-go, so it makes you wrestle with it. Why did God kill my grandma? Not a good intellectual question. Why was God responsible for X, Y, Z? Not a good intellectual question. And so part of it is, even in this, as a person is to go, maybe I don't know a good question to ask, so I need other people to try and help me think through this, right? Last question, what does my brother and sister in Christ have to say about this? But then in the non-religious version, it says, what advice have I been given that I know I should take, but I haven't, something to that extent. Because typically, and what I find is people who are if they're a Christian and they're specific, or whatever faith, and they're consulting people outside of their faith, when we're here in the fragile section, they go, it all matches up, but then if there's a Christian, typically if there's Christian advice here and non-Christian, they don't add up. Or if it's the same people, there's no difference. And man, that's a really powerful thing for someone to notice. I've got all these people that care about me and love me telling me this is what I need to do. Or at the very least, this is how I need to think about it. And then the last question is, does God honor my current emotions? We'll get back there in just a moment. So here's what this process would look like, okay? And I'll just go for you personally, because I've used this process on my own. I find a question, okay, what is something I want to grow out of? All those questions that were up there, right? And then the first thing I do is I start with reading Psalm 46:10. Now, if you're not a Christian, you can use kind of what I said is, or consider like a quick breathing or grounding exercise. I kind of mix the two up. I'm a huge breathwork nut, and so what I'll do with people is I will say, take 3 deep breaths before we start. If they're a Christian, I'll say, what I want you to do is on the inhale, think, be still and know. And on the exhale, that I am God. Three breaths, and you don't even have to use that scripture, but even those 3 breaths, those 3 intentional breaths, it actually activates the parasympathetic nervous system. And so it will allow you to start calming down even if you don't believe in it. There's a biological reality that takes place. So we start there, right? And then we work our way through each one of these questions systematically and in order, right? Told you what those questions were, and then we get to the turn. What does God have to say about this? And what I'll usually say, and what I said to Sarah and John, and I'll share both of their answers. I said, what does the mean God? The sky daddy in the with a wand who's smiting people back and forth. He just heard all your you-know-what and complaining about your situation. What does that version of God have to say to you? And it's so fascinating because they go along with me. And what John had said to me, remember he was the guy who had his dream job offered to him. He goes, I think God would say, you're a fake, you're a phony. Like, that's why I did this. I wanted you to get a taste of what life could have been like in ministry. You and I both know you're not cut out for it, so I'm taking you out before you cause any damage. Okay, good for you. Sarah, with her cousin, goes, her comment was, who cares? I don't care about your feelings. Yet she doesn't care about your feelings. You should care more that your dad is dead, not that this person can't talk to you after. Like, get over it. So what I want to say is, for both of those people, whether or not it was right, when we're in this track, that's a good thing to get out. Because I'll tell you what I've found is letting people answer these questions with zero judgment usually allows this turn to actually take place. It usually allows me to then go, okay, how you feeling? And by the time we get to spiritual, they're usually crying, whether they're a Christian or not. Remember, Sarah was not a Christian. And what ended up happening was this turn. It was the first time that she communicated to me, she felt like God was revealing himself to her. And that's why it's so important when I say time to decide, thermometer or thermostat, you need time for both. You cannot set the temperature if you don't know how hot it is. And so it's important to actually identify, to say, yeah, it is 110 degrees. I'm burning up. But now, right? Now I want to actually go inside and do the thermostat versus just lay down on the ground and wonder why I'm getting sunburned and dehydrated. So in that turn, I ask the exact same question I think I do on both documents. I ask the exact same question because then what I say is, all right, now what I want you to do is whoever your higher power God, but for me, Jesus, imagine he's sitting right across from you. Okay? Sitting right across from you in a room. You just said the negative thing. But everything that you know about God, about who he is, about how God has revealed himself to people that are close to you in your life, the scriptures that you remember, the stories, the testimony that you have, what would you really have to say about this? And what was helpful was John was the one that said, you know what? I think he'd say the exact same thing, but I'm okay with it now. You are a fake, you are a phony, you are weak, but that's exactly the type of people that I use in my church, is people that are not strong, people that are weak, and so I can use you in spite of your weaknesses. Awesome. And then it starts this train of continuing to grow through the wheel. But then Sarah had said, I don't know. I have no idea. I don't know God. And again, whether you're a Christian or not, that guy was not a Christian in the video. The spiritual piece of it is it's your purpose in life. It's whatever you give yourself over to. And so it's, okay, it might not be God or may not be Jesus, but like, okay, what you've lived your life for, what would that thing have to say in response to this? And very few people give themselves over to a purpose in life that would not be supportive or encouraging or optimistic, right? And so it's given to that side of what you can actually hope and believe in. And then we go through all the questions, right, where we prioritize accuracy and truth over emotional honesty until we get to this question. Does God honor my current emotions? Not, how should I feel? How does he want me to feel? Should I feel this way? It's where you stand before God or whoever it is, where you stand, can you say, you know what, I'm good and I think that he'd be good with me? If the answer is no, that's okay. Because then what we can do is we can go and ask all these questions again. Or if you would prefer, you're the type of person that says, you know what, actually I'm pretty healthy, physical stuff, I got good friendships, I'm not even really bothered with that. That's where all those markings exist to say, you know what, fine. Go ahead and bypass emotional, relational, and then step on into intellectual and wrestle with that question again. But whatever question you wrestle with in the fragile track, you want to make sure that you do its opposite in the anti-fragile track, right? We don't ever want to just sit in a place where we're just valuing emotional honesty or truth. You want both to live in harmony with one another. So then we get to, again, okay, maybe the answer is yes or no. So the question then becomes, what if you get to this question and you keep saying no consistently? I'm not okay. I haven't grown. I'm not okay. I'm glad you asked. How do we get unstuck and move forward? I'm going to go ahead and pass a copy of this down. Don't look at it just quite yet because I'm going to use, this is two images, right? So if we were to consider this wheel as a concealed water wheel, okay? Concealed, where these sort of act as barriers or dams. Is there a hole in one of the chambers that's throwing off the equilibrium of the wheel? Because if you puncture one of these and these dams are actually intact, over time the equilibrium will get all wonky and the machine will break or the wheel will fly off. Imagine for a moment you were to take those barriers out. Are there any chambers that have been infected? As it's spinning, maybe you allowed a bad friend to enter your life, or you allowed someone to come back into your life, and guess what? That was poisonous, that was toxic, and then as that wheel spins, it just infects everything. Right? So do we need to maybe perhaps shut the dams off, purify everything? Do we need to get rid of everything, start from fresh, start from scratch? This is my personal favorite because it was my own experience. I remember I was taking myself through this wheel through a difficult season of life. And I thought, if I were to throw a high-powered magnet into the middle, and this was made of metal, what chamber would it affix to immediately? Like, which one of these chambers has got metal on it? And for me, I'll just share vulnerably, I was taking myself through this practice, and the second I got to this moment where I was stuck, just thought for a second, and I just had that image in my mind, and it just went boom, like up to spiritual. Like, you know exactly why you're struggling through this. Just get over it, confront it, and you'll be done. And we have so many relationships like that in our lives. We have so many questions, maybe physical ailments. Or perhaps consider a tree, its roots, its stump, trunks, branches, leaves, and fruit. And how I want to talk about this for a second is let's look at the totality of this image. Okay, and what I want to start with is down here, right? Because this is basically saying, imagine this tree is your life. And each one of these sort of fifths is you as a spire person. What ends up happening, and so I drew this, and I haven't had time to make edits to it yet the way I want to, but sort of what I want to try and visualize is imagine trauma being this asteroid, this comet, right, that you can't control. And what it does is it comes and it nails this tree right? And what happens is when it nails the tree, it leaves an infection in it. All right? Once that infection takes place, it starts to grow. After enough time after growth, it bears into fruit, right? And so often what we end up doing is we do the exact opposite. So Tina, just because you'd shared before, how much easier would it have been for me to say, the problem is you need to stop smoking? That would have been the easiest thing to pick.
Absolutely.
Right? But if we take it right here, okay, substance abuse. Okay, cool. What happens if I go ahead and cut that bad boy off?
Probably another one.
It'll grow right back eventually. Right? And so once we start to think, okay, substance abuse might be what's showing, but what might it actually be? And for me, again, being from a Christian background, I read this awesome book called Glittering Vices. It's a fresh take on the 7 deadly sins. But 7 deadly sins is sort of, that's what's on the bottom there. That's something that's sort of universally accepted at least. Like no one goes like, these things are good, right? So taking her perspective from that, it's like, okay, so maybe substance abuse isn't so much I like to get high or I like to get a head high. It's I'm restless. If we follow it all the way down, I'm callous to people. I'm defensive, and maybe did I follow the right one? See, this is the difficulty. Oh yeah, maybe I'm self-loathing, and ultimately, no, I followed the wrong path again. Compulsive, yeah, and then it gets down to gluttony, right? And so it's like maybe the reality is like I'm just not satisfied with what I have. I need more. Again, if we go into gossip. Right, if you follow the path here, it's bitterness because gossip, the reason that you gossip or the reason that you ultimately, I think it ultimately gets its way back down to envy, you're just bitter when others are better, right? So you might gossip about someone, you can change your behavior, but are you changing that thing in your heart that goes, I'm happy that they're doing better versus I'm getting bitter when they're better? So I think that's where that is super helpful. And then what ends up happening is then the decision is, if it's reached the fruit level, what happens if you cut this branch off?
It grows back.
It'll grow back. What happens if the infection started down here and you cut it off here? It's still there, right? And so part of where I think this image is helpful is for you, I think in each one of these areas, you sort of have to take an inventory for yourself and go, is this a little contaminated, but this is super contaminated? And how contaminated is it? And
I have actually had to take a look at all of it lately, and I have to be very careful of every aspect. And it's not something that just, it's an ongoing thing that never stops. I'm always looking at it.
so, amen, and say we lop it off here instead. Maybe you don't have to start a whole new tree, but even if this infection is here, right, over time, we don't have as much infection to deal with, but over time, it'll start infecting other things, right? And so sometimes what we might have to do is start right from the beginning, cut the whole thing down, and say, we got to build an assumptive world. And again, this doesn't mean throw your life away, but it just means like, you know what? Maybe I just got to literally... My daughter right now, she's 4 years old. God is my witness, and my 2-year-old. Pray for them with a father that is both a pastor, mom is a vice principal of their school, and you've heard how I talk. There's never going to be a time when they're like, how are you doing? Fine. Sounds good. I'll see you in 20 minutes. It's like, no, let's talk about it, right? So even at 4 and 2 right now, when they get super frustrated and when they can't necessarily communicate themselves, here's what they'll do. Reset. I'm happy now. I'm not kidding. They literally hit the ground, push reset, and walk away. I'm happy now. And I think sometimes that's what that tree lopping looks like. It's like, all right, I may not believe it. It's still going to hurt, but I got to try and find a way to push reset. But what I love about the imagery of a tree instead of a water wheel, say you cut it down here. Hey, got to start over completely. What's still going to be visible when you cut the stump? Which represents life, age, as long as it's not hollowed out, hey, we still got life that we can build upon, right? Like this thing isn't destroyed yet. And the beauty of it is, before, maybe when you were a kid, it's just a little twig, but now that you got a trunk to deal with, now you got all of these life experiences to start over with.
I was gonna say knowledge.
Yeah, no, but yeah, age, life, all. But what that represents is you get to start over with a slate that you did not have when you first experienced this toxic stress. And then what you might be able to do is build up an entirely different tree. And then what you do is, rather than having these things live there comfortably and rent-free, you start to put up a fence that says, all right, if that comet comes in, it hits. It bounces off. And what we ended up having to do is replace all these things with what I would say is post-traumatic growth measures. Learn to put yourself out there. Learn to share your story. All of those things. But I think this is, if we get unstuck, that's where anytime someone says, I just need to do fill-in-the-blank behavior and everything will get better. No, it won't. That is the beginning. It's the first step. All right, so knowing all that, okay, you've dealt with some of that stuff. Does God honor my current emotions? Let's say you say, yeah, all right, I feel good about where I'm at. Great. If you're a Christian, or if you resonate with the verse I shared, all right, yeah, I feel good. Can you accept that? Can you actually read it and go, all right, in light of everything I just dealt with, you don't need a solution, you don't need to fix it, it's just, can you actually still be still? Can you actually be content? Can you actually dare to think that way? If the answer is no, cool, there's grace, then go through it again. But if it does get to a part where they say yes, this is why gratitude's at the top. And if you're a person who's walking through it yourself, I would encourage you to try and say it out loud. If not, write it down. And it doesn't have to be gratitude, just I'm thankful that I got to do this process. Identify one thing, small or big. But if you're someone facilitating, and I want to share one story from my seminary experience. Has anyone ever heard of a genogram project? So a genogram is this, did I tell this story last time, public recognition? No, okay. A genogram is basically a trauma family tree, or emotional family tree on steroids, right? A family tree says, who's your mom, who's your dad, who's your grandma, your grandpa. A genogram says, hey, who's your mom, who's your grandpa, and what are all the difficulties that you had in that relationship? What's all the difficulties that mom had with grandma? What's all the difficulties that mom had with uncle from this side of the family? No joke, my classmates and each one of my cohort, so I had 4 other people I had to share this with, nice, neat, prim piece of paper with lines. I was just like, as soon as I saw that, the amount of shame that went through I was like, oh no. I brought an 11 by 17. I had a key. It was colored to the max. There was like no space left on that thing. And it was probably the most uncomfortable seminary experience of my life, hearing all these people share all their stories. I'm like, well, how much time do we got? Because I could share the whole thing. But then what ended up happening was there was a transformational moment, was at the, get emotional every time, but one of the guys from my seminary, my group, in the prayer, he started by saying, God, thank you for the gift that Eric's family is. Thank you for the good that they've been. Thank you for all the blessing that they brought to his life. And I started weeping uncontrollably. And he asked me why afterwards. I said, I'm used to people apologizing for my family. I'm used to people bearing. I'm used to having to be the one that has to be stronger under other people's reaction to my family. I said, but I remember my family. I remember when I was 6, 7, 8. I remember the good. I remember the positive. And I know that that's not just completely gone and void. And so for you to just say thank you, it was just a moment of honoring this in my life and allowing me to somehow add value to it where I didn't. And so if you're someone who's walking through someone, be that person, whether it's a prayer or whether it's a very specific, I'm so grateful for this, and identify it with something that had to do with the pain. You know, with Sarah, I said, I'm so grateful that in the midst of all this crap, God was revealing himself to you, like from what you said. And like, I can see the lightness from you, even in this moment. And I think maybe God's going to use this for something else. In the John example, I just said, I'm thankful that you use broken vessels like you and like me. And each time they end up start crying, getting emotional in some way, shape, or form. And then I like to end with the Lord's Prayer. And if you have a different thing, maybe it's, what's the Alcoholics Anonymous, the prayer of Serenity, yeah. But where I like the Lord's Prayer is, especially after, so think about if you were to go through this process, like how complex the whole thing seems. Right? Like, gosh, where do I start? Blah, 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 I know what I do. Well, the Lord's Prayer is, I think where it's helpful, it's, all right, I got a Father. He's bigger than me. This world sucks. I hope he can make it better. Please make sure that I have food today. Please forgive me when I'm a jerk. Help me to be gracious with people that are jerks to me. Please don't make me do anything bad, and please protect me when I get tempted from it. Thank you. There's this simplicity of that's all we need. We just need to figure out a way to be content in every single circumstance that we're walking through. And so I find it's a very appropriate way to end the entire time together. But again, even the prayer of serenity would be a really impactful one, because I think post-traumatic growth happens when we finally go, okay, it's not in my hands. I want it to be, and that's what's caused all this pain and this continued suffering is I want to fix it, but I can't.